He ripped off Chuck Norris's wife's dress right on the street. 10 seconds later, the officer was lying on the asphalt. But what happened next was unexpected. Watch until the end and write in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The streets of downtown Dallas shimmered beneath the glow of street lamps as the city settled into the velvet calm of evening. Neon signs flickered gently, their hues blending with the deep indigo sky. From a distance, the hum of traffic sounded almost musical. Distant horns, tires rolling over asphalt, and the occasional laughter from patios and open bars. In the midst of this nightly rhythm, a black Ford Expedition sat parked along a wide, well-kept curb, its sleek body catching hints of gold from passing headlights. From the ornate glass doors of the French Room, one of the city's most iconic and refined restaurants, a couple emerged into the quiet, humid warmth of the Texas night. The man was unmistakable. Tall, broad-shouldered, carrying himself with the deliberate calm of a man long accustomed to attention. Chuck Norris, even in his later years, had lost none of his quiet intensity. His jeans fit snug but comfortably around his frame. His dark shirt tucked in neatly, the familiar black Stetson perched atop his head like a crown earned rather than worn. There was no swagger in his step, just purpose, solid and steady. Beside him, holding lightly to his arm, walked Gina O'Kelly. Her grace was not the kind that drew instant stares. It was the slower kind, the kind that settled on people only after they realized how perfectly poised she was. She wore a navy blue gown that hugged her silhouette with tasteful elegance, its fabric catching just enough of the streetlights to shimmer like still water beneath moonlight. Her honey blonde hair was swept back, her earrings glinting as she moved, and the smile she wore was genuine, gentle, the smile of a woman who felt safe. Chuck opened the door for her with a slight nod of the head, and she stepped out first, heels clicking softly on the smooth stone. He followed, their pace slow but assured, hands brushing, then clasping. "That dessert was dangerously good," she murmured, her voice filled with contentment. He smiled faintly, the way he often did, subtle but sincere. "I figured you deserved something sweet tonight." Gina leaned her head lightly against his shoulder as they walked. "You always say that, but you always mean it." They crossed the quiet sidewalk with the rhythm of people who weren't in a rush, who had nowhere urgent to be except with each other. The SUV waited just across the street, black paint polished and spotless, the evening lights reflecting in its windows. Chuck reached into his pocket for the keys, but paused mid-step, his eyes narrowing slightly. Two figures stood near their vehicle. Both wore police uniforms, standard Navy LAPD attire, though this was Dallas. That detail didn't escape Chuck's attention. Perhaps they were on loan, he thought, or working under some interdepartmental agreement. One of the officers was broad and thick-necked, with short-cropped hair and a jawline like a shovel. He leaned against the patrol car with arms crossed and an expression stuck somewhere between boredom and suspicion. The other, leaner and younger, chewed gum slowly, the motion deliberate, theatrical. His eyes tracked the couple as they approached, not with curiosity but with something harder to define. Calculated scrutiny, maybe, or something worse. Chuck continued forward, not changing his pace, but he shifted his posture slightly, shoulders squaring, chin lifting. Gina's fingers tightened slightly around his. "Are those Dallas officers?" she whispered. "No," he said simply. "L.A. That's strange, isn't it?" "Yeah." As they neared the SUV, the broader officer pushed himself upright and stepped forward with a practiced slowness that suggested he was used to people reacting when he moved. He held out a hand, not in greeting, but in obstruction. "Evening," he said. His voice was deep, gravelly. "This your vehicle?" Chuck stopped a pace short of him. "It is." "Mind showing me your license and registration?" Gina looked up at Chuck, puzzled. He didn't flinch. "Problem, officer?" Chuck asked, his voice calm but firm. The lankier officer peeled himself from the side of the patrol car, joining the first. He blew a small bubble with his gum, let it pop, and sucked it back in. "Just routine," he said. "A lot of reports of stolen SUVs in this area lately. This one fits the description. Big, black, expensive." Gina shifted uncomfortably, sensing something off. "That's a coincidence," Chuck said, "because this one was parked legally for about 2 hours under surveillance in a valet-monitored lot, and it's registered to me." "Mind if we verify that?" the first officer asked again. Chuck reached slowly into his jacket, pulling out his wallet and calmly handing over his ID. The broad officer took it, his eyes flicking to the name. For a second, something registered, something like recognition, but it vanished quickly behind his neutral mask. "Chuck Norris," the younger one said, reading the ID over his partner's shoulder. "Huh? That a stage name?" Chuck looked at him. "No." The officer grinned, leaning to look at Gina. "And what about you, miss? What's your name?" "Gina O'Kelly," she said, standing taller but not taking a step forward. "Nice dress," the officer said, his eyes lingering longer than was polite. "Must have cost a fortune." "That's none of your business," Chuck said, voice low. The second officer raised an eyebrow. "No harm in a compliment, right?" But there was no sincerity in it. The way he said it, the way he looked at Gina, it wasn't admiration. It was predatory. A cold wave passed between them. Gina tightened her grip on Chuck's arm again. "Can we just go?" "I'm trying," Chuck murmured, still calm. The bigger officer handed back the license but didn't step aside. "You in town for business, sir?" Chuck didn't answer immediately. "Personal?" "Right. Just seems odd. Out-of-town celebrity, fancy wheels, pretty wife." He looked at Gina again. "Very pretty wife." Chuck's shoulders rolled slightly as he drew in a slow breath. It wasn't anger yet. It was the awareness that anger might soon be appropriate. "Is there a reason this is going further than verifying ownership?" he asked. The gum-chewing officer stepped forward. "We get a lot of scams, identity theft, fake registrations. Mind if we check the VIN?" Chuck gestured toward the front of the vehicle. "Go ahead." But as the officer moved, he didn't go toward the front. Instead, he passed closer to Gina, so close she had to step aside to avoid contact. His hand brushed the side of her waist. It looked like an accident, but it wasn't. She flinched. Chuck's hand moved subtly, resting on the small of her back, grounding her. "It's fine," she whispered. "Let's just let them do their job." But it wasn't fine, and it wasn't over. The younger officer stopped beside her again. "You always dress like this?" he asked. "Back off," Chuck said, the first note of warning in his voice. The officer laughed under his breath. No harm, no foul. Then it happened. The older officer, standing just beside the open passenger door, reached forward, fingers grazing the edge of Gina's gown near her hip. "This material," he said mockingly. "It real silk?" She stepped away instinctively, but not before his hand caught the seam and pulled. The sound of tearing fabric was loud and obscene in the quiet night. Gina gasped, her hand flying to her side to cover the exposed skin, the shredded edge of the gown curling uselessly beneath her fingers. Chuck's world narrowed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move fast. He simply looked at the man who had touched his wife and said, with the cold finality of a gun cocking, "You just made a mistake." And the night changed. The silence that followed Chuck's words wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating. The distant sounds of the city dimmed into nothingness, swallowed by the raw tension suspended between four people on a quiet Dallas sidewalk. The torn fabric of Gina's gown fluttered slightly in the warm breeze, the delicate shimmer of silk now hanging in ruin. Her hand was still pressed firmly to her side, her knuckles pale, her body unmoving. Her face was flushed with shock, her eyes searching Chuck's for some measure of reassurance, some tether to reality. But Chuck didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the man who had touched his wife, the man whose hand had just torn away not only fabric but dignity. Officer Tervor Blake stood less than 2 feet away, his smirk now faded into a curious mixture of challenge and hesitation. His partner, Officer Cody Martin, lingered a few steps behind, watching with his jaw set, chewing gum slowly as though daring Chuck to make the next move. Gina finally spoke, her voice trembling but still clear. "Chuck, please, let's just go." Chuck didn't move. He didn't nod or even blink. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quiet, like distant thunder, controlled but inevitable. "Touch her again," he said, "and I'll make sure you never touch anyone." Martin let out a short laugh, but it died quickly in his throat. Something about Chuck's posture, the absolute stillness of it, suggested anything but a bluff. Blake's expression tightened into something harder. Anger, pride, maybe fear. He flexed the fingers of his right hand, the one that had just assaulted a woman under the pretense of authority. "Whoa now," Blake said, attempting to shift the tone. "No need to make threats, Mr. Norris. We're just doing our jobs." Chuck's eyes narrowed. "Your job ends where my wife's body begins." Martin took a step forward. "You think you can intimidate us because you're some old action star? This isn't Hollywood. We're the law." Chuck turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Martin's eyes. "You wear the uniform, but you're not the law. You're a disgrace to it." Martin's nostrils flared. For a split second it looked as if he might act, might step forward in some display of force. Instead, he glanced at Blake, unsure. Blake squared his shoulders, puffing out his chest like a man trying to remember his own size. "You're resisting police orders," Blake said, the official tone returning as a shield. "We have every right to detain you." "For what?" Chuck asked calmly. "Standing beside my wife?" Gina tugged lightly at Chuck's sleeve. Her voice was lower now, more urgent. "Chuck, please. Let's just walk away. We don't need this." But Chuck knew better. This wasn't something to walk away from. There were lines in life, invisible but sacred. Some lines, once crossed, demanded more than patience. They demanded response. Blake took a deliberate step forward. The proximity was aggressive, intentional. He tilted his head toward Gina, eyes lingering far too long again. "I asked you a question earlier, ma'am," he said. "Is that real silk?" She didn't answer. He reached out again, fingers extended, moving toward the torn fabric as if to mock the damage he'd already done. And in that instant, everything changed. Chuck moved. It wasn't explosive, it wasn't theatrical, but it was sudden and absolute. His hand snapped up, intercepting Blake's wrist with a grip so fast it blurred, so precise it looked rehearsed. The motion was clean, elegant, merciless. Blake let out a surprised grunt as his arm twisted backward, pain radiating up to his shoulder. Chuck held him there, arm half raised, wrist locked tight in a vise. "I said," Chuck repeated, "don't touch her." Blake tried to pull back, but Chuck's grip was unyielding. There was no anger in his face, only a cold, practiced control that came from years of discipline, years of knowing exactly how much force to use and when. "Let go of me," Blake growled through clenched teeth. "I'm stopping you from doing something even dumber than what you already did," Chuck replied. Martin lunged forward then, both hands out, no longer hiding behind sarcasm. "Let him go." But Chuck anticipated the move. He shifted sideways with a fluid precision, guiding Gina behind him in one seamless step, using his own body as a shield. Martin reached for his baton, but Chuck's hand shot out again, catching the officer's wrist before he could draw. There was a second of stillness, the kind of moment where everything balances on the edge of a blade. Then Chuck twisted Martin's arm with a controlled torque that dropped the younger man to one knee, a strangled cry escaping his throat as the baton clattered to the pavement. Blake, released, stumbled backward, red-faced and breathing heavily. He looked at Chuck with open fury, but also something else, uncertainty. Fear, perhaps, disguised as defiance. "You just assaulted 2 officers, Blake said. "No," Chuck answered, stepping back. "I prevented 2 assaults, and if you think I'm wrong, go ahead, call it in." The sidewalk was now no longer empty. A few pedestrians had stopped at a distance, unsure whether to intervene or flee. A man across the street had pulled out his phone, camera recording. A woman gasped audibly as she approached the scene, recognized Chuck, and froze in disbelief. Martin scrambled to his feet, shaking out his arm with a grimace. He looked at Blake, uncertain. Blake sneered. "You really think you can get away with this because you're famous?" Chuck's voice was steady, low. "This has nothing to do with fame. This has everything to do with what you did to my wife." Blake's mouth twisted. "She overreacted." Gina's voice cut in then, firm and furious. "I did not overreact. You put your hands on me. You ripped my dress. You humiliated me in public." Chuck turned to her briefly, his eyes softening just a little. Then he looked back to the officers. "You don't get to do that," he said. "Not to her, not to anyone." There was a long pause, the kind that fills the space between escalation and decision. Blake and Martin exchanged a glance, their arrogance beginning to fray at the edges. Chuck stepped forward slowly. "You can leave now. You can pretend this didn't happen, and I'll let it end here. But if either of you touches her again, if you so much as follow us, I won't hold back." Blake opened his mouth, then closed it again. Martin stooped to pick up his baton, his hands shaking. The smugness was gone now, replaced by something more cautious. Chuck took off his jacket and draped it gently over Gina's shoulders. She held it closed with both hands, still trembling slightly, her breath shallow but steady. Her eyes didn't leave Chuck's. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded once. He turned back to the officers. "Apologize to my wife," he said. Blake looked away, jaw clenched. Martin swallowed hard. Gina's voice, though soft, was like steel. "You think we'll forget this? That I'll forget the way you looked at me? Touched me? You don't deserve the badge you wear." Blake stared at the ground. "I'm sorry," he muttered, the words bitter in his mouth. Martin nodded, barely audible. "Didn't mean for it to go that way." Chuck shook his head. "You meant exactly what you did. You just didn't expect consequences." Another silence. The city sounds crept back in. Cars, music, distant conversation. The world resumed its rhythm as if nothing had happened, but everything had. Chuck walked Gina to the SUV, opened the passenger door, and helped her inside. She sat down, carefully adjusting the torn gown beneath the safety of his jacket. He closed the door gently, then turned back toward the two officers. "Don't follow us," he said. Blake said nothing. Chuck walked around the front of the SUV, got into the driver's seat, and started the engine. They pulled away from the curb with slow, deliberate calm. Behind them, the two officers stood motionless, bruised both physically and in pride, watching as the couple disappeared into the night. They had crossed a line, and Chuck Norris had drawn a new one in its place. The drive home unfolded in an almost unbearable stillness. The Ford Expedition glided along the lamp-lit streets of Dallas, the city's usual nighttime vibrance dimmed behind the thick glass of the SUV. Inside, Chuck's hands remained firm on the steering wheel, his knuckles no longer white with tension, but his gaze still laser-focused on the road ahead. His shoulders, broad and composed, gave no outward signal of turmoil, but Gina could feel the pressure radiating from him like heat from sun-baked stone. She sat beside him, cocooned in his jacket, her torn gown hidden beneath the coarse fabric. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by a strange hollowness, a lingering echo of humiliation that neither tears nor words could immediately dissolve. Her eyes drifted to the window, where the blur of passing buildings offered no comfort, only distraction. The neon signs and quiet corners, once romantic, now seemed foreign and harsh. They hadn't spoken since they left the scene. She had tried, briefly, with a whispered, "Thank you," but Chuck hadn't responded, not out of coldness, but out of deliberation. She knew him. He was parsing everything, measuring the consequences, planned back each moment in perfect clarity, as only a man trained to observe before acting could do. And she knew he wasn't finished. What he had done on the sidewalk wasn't closure. It was a pause in the storm. The lights of the city gave way to the darker, quieter streets near their neighborhood, a gated community on the edge of a gentle slope overlooking downtown. As they approached the entrance, the iron gate parted without delay, recognizing the vehicle's license plate and allowing them through. The security guard inside the booth gave a short nod, but Chuck didn't return it. He pulled into the driveway, parked, and turned off the engine with one clean motion. Only then did he look at her. "You're hurt," he said, though it wasn't a question. "I'm fine," she answered, not looking at him. "No," he said, "you're not." Gina turned her head, her eyes meeting his. "You stopped them." He held her gaze. "I didn't stop enough." She reached for the door handle. "Let's just go inside." Chuck came around and opened her door before she could, offering his hand. She took it without hesitation, letting him help her up and guide her through the front door. Inside, the air was cool and scented with the soft trace of cedar and lemon oil. Their home was quiet, just as they had left it, but something in its stillness felt different, like a sacred space breached. In the kitchen, Chuck poured her a glass of water while she stepped away to the bedroom to change. He didn't follow. Instead, he leaned on the edge of the counter, glass untouched in his hand, his other arm braced against the marble. He stared at nothing, his mind still entrenched in the precise sequence of events. The way Blake's hand had moved, the sound of tearing silk, the look in Gina's eyes when it happened. He had stopped the act, yes, but not before the damage was done. When she returned, wearing a soft gray robe cinched tightly around her waist, her hair brushed back, and her makeup washed away, she looked less like the woman who had been humiliated and more like the woman who had endured. Still, there was fragility in her posture, controlled but visible, the way a branch bends under snow just before it snaps. She sat across from him at the kitchen island, the overhead light casting gentle halos on the granite. Chuck placed the water in front of her. She didn't drink. "Do you think they'll come after you?" she asked finally. "They already tried," he said. Again." Chuck hesitated. Then, as if answering a different question altogether, he replied, "There's a difference between vengeance and justice. Tonight, they crossed into something uglier than abuse of power. They became predators, and predators don't stop because they're embarrassed. They stop when they're made to feel prey." A silence stretched between them. She stared down at the rim of her glass, fingers tracing the edge. "They weren't just trying to assert control," she said. "They were trying to strip something from me, to make me small, like I didn't matter." "You do," he said instantly. "I know," she said, "because of you. But out there, I didn't feel like a woman. I felt like a target." Chuck stood. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere, like a tide changing the shore. He came to her side and crouched slightly, placing one hand on her knee, the other under her chin, tilting her face toward his. "They didn't break you," he said. "They couldn't. You're here. You're strong. And I will never let anyone make you feel less than you are." She looked into his eyes, and for the first time since the incident, her own brimmed with tears, not of fear, but of release. Then the doorbell rang. It wasn't the chime they were used to, the familiar digital melody from their friends or family. This was the low, buzzing ring of the gate intercom at the front of the property. Chuck stood at once, his back straightening. Gina followed him with her eyes, worry creeping across her face. "Who would come this late?" she asked. Chuck didn't answer. He moved through the hallway with measured strides and pressed the screen on the wall. The security camera flickered on, showing the long stone path leading from the gate and a patrol car idling just beyond the threshold. Same unit number. Chuck zoomed in on the image. A single figure stood at the gate. Blake. He was alone. Chuck's jaw tightened. Gina came up behind him, barefoot and silent. "Is it them?" He nodded once. "Yes." "Don't open it." But he was already pressing the release. The gate began to swing open, its metal hinges groaning slightly under the strain. Blake stepped forward slowly, not with arrogance, but with a subdued gait. His hands were at his sides. No weapon, no radio, no partner. The wind stirred the trees around the property as he walked, each of his steps sounding louder than they should have. Chuck opened the front door before Blake could knock. They stood face to face again, but this time the dynamic had changed. Blake looked smaller somehow, less sure of himself. His uniform was still crisp, but his lip bore the remains of a bruise, and the way he avoided Chuck's eyes told the rest. "I'm not here on duty," Blake said. "No call, no backup, just me." Chuck said nothing. Blake looked down at the flagstone beneath his boots. "They pulled the body cam footage this morning. Internal Affairs flagged it immediately. Said there'd be an inquiry. I didn't think it looked that bad, not at first. But then I saw your wife's face, the way she stepped back, the way she looked at me like I was a threat." "You were," Chuck said. Blake nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I was." Gina came to stand beside Chuck. She wasn't trembling anymore. She wore the same robe, but her spine was straight, her chin high. "You didn't just tear a dress," she said. "You tried to tear away my dignity in public, and you laughed while doing it." Blake's mouth opened, but no words came out. He swallowed hard, looking more ashamed than afraid. "I know," he said eventually. "I didn't come to make excuses. I went home ready to file a complaint. I thought I was the victim, but when I watched it back, I saw a man I didn't recognize, and I hated him. Chuck studied him with that same unblinking calm. Then do better. Blake looked up. I want to. Good, Gina said quietly, because we don't want revenge. We want to be able to walk down the street without fear. We want to be people again, not profiles. Blake turned as if to leave, then hesitated. Martin, he's been suspended. IA is digging into his record. That's part of why I came before this gets worse. Chuck nodded once. Then go. Blake took the dismissal without protest. He turned and began the slow walk back toward the gate. Chuck and Gina watched in silence. Inside, the house returned to stillness, but something had shifted. Not a restoration of peace, not yet, but the first crack in the wall of injustice that had tried to enclose them. A crack made by a man not through violence, but through control, through presence. Gina turned to Chuck, her voice soft. You didn't have to say anything, she said. Just being there last night, that was enough. Chuck reached for her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers with quiet strength. You were never alone, he said, not for a second. And in the darkness beyond the gate, the patrol car pulled away, swallowed by the silence of the Dallas night. Morning light broke slowly across the Dallas skyline, slipping past thick curtains and onto the polished floors of the Norris residence. Golden beams touched the edge of the white oak bed where Chuck sat at the foot, already dressed, boots laced and shirt buttoned, his eyes distant. The robe Gina had worn the night before lay folded beside him, her soft footsteps the only sound as she moved through the house behind him. The atmosphere remained subdued, like the breath held after a long storm, though the winds had yet to fully settle. Neither of them had slept much. Chuck had spent most of the night sitting upright in the armchair near the window, arms folded, eyes unfocused, his thoughts circling in slow, deliberate orbits. Gina had tried to rest, but sleep eluded her. Each time her eyelids fell, the memory of fabric tearing, the cruel smirks, the shame pressed against her skin like fingerprints, came rushing back. She hadn't cried. Not last night. Not this morning. She wasn't sure if that was strength or shock. She entered the bedroom, finding him exactly where she expected. He hadn't moved in 10 minutes, maybe longer. Are you okay? She asked, knowing it was a hollow question. I'm thinking, he said without turning. Gina came to his side and sat down gently. Did you sleep? A little. Enough. He turned his head and looked at her then, taking in her face. Free of makeup now, her hair loosely tied back, the quiet determination that still lived in her eyes even through fatigue. He reached out and touched her hand, his palm rough against her fingers. They won't stop, you know, she said, watching his face. Even with the apology, even with the footage. I know, he said. That's why I'm not finished. There was no anger in his voice, only certainty. A soft chime interrupted them, the intercom at the front gate. They both stood almost simultaneously, the momentary peace vanishing into alertness. Chuck stepped into the hallway and tapped the wall-mounted screen. The video feed came alive. Another patrol car, but not Blake. This time it was a marked cruiser with a uniformed officer neither of them recognized. Beside him stood a man in a suit, early 50s, square-faced, eyes hidden behind dark lenses. Chuck narrowed his gaze. Not press, not a reporter. This one had the bearing of someone official. He pressed the button to speak. Can I help you? The suited man leaned toward the speaker. Captain Harrow, Internal Affairs. We'd like to speak with Mr. and Mrs. Norris, if possible. Gina came into view, hovering just behind him. Chuck met her eyes briefly, then turned back to the intercom and released the gate. Captain Harrow approached the front door alone, while the officer remained by the cruiser. Chuck opened the door before he could knock. There was no greeting, just a quiet standoff of presence. Harrow took off his sunglasses, tucking them into his jacket. "Mr. Norris, ma'am." "Come in," Chuck said flatly. They stepped into the living room. Gina moved to the arm of the couch, standing rather than sitting. Harrow didn't ask for permission to speak. He simply began. "Last night's incident came to our attention through multiple channels. Body cam footage, civilian recordings, a few news tips. As of this morning, both officers involved, Blake and Martin, are under formal investigation." Chuck said nothing. Harrow continued, his voice low and level. "Mr. Norris, I want to be clear. What you did last night walks the very fine line between self-defense and retaliation. Technically, you disarmed and subdued 2 officers. That's no small thing." "They put hands on my wife," Chuck said. "They didn't deserve their weapons." "I'm not arguing with you," Harrow replied. "I'm saying it's complicated. If you weren't who you are, we might be having this conversation differently." "So, you're here to protect them?" "No. I'm here to contain a situation before it explodes." He paused, studying Chuck's face. "But I'm also here to tell you that you're not the one under fire. Not this time." Gina spoke then. "They touched me. They tore my dress, and they laughed." Harrow nodded slowly. "That's why Martin's been suspended. Blake voluntarily removed himself from field duty this morning. I reviewed the footage personally. It was enough." Chuck stepped forward slightly. "Then why are you really here?" Harrow's expression changed ever so slightly. "Because I don't think they're finished. You humiliated them. That doesn't sit well with men like that. They don't think of what they did as wrong. They think of being caught as the crime." Chuck's jaw tightened. "Then what are you going to do?" "I can't protect you from shadow plays. If they decide to act outside the system, there's no report I can file to stop it. But I can warn you. And I can assure you that if they come at you through legal channels, I'll be ready." Chuck looked to Gina. She had crossed her arms now, her body rigid with fatigue and resentment. "They already came after us," she said. "What's left?" "Publicity," Harrow said. "Twisted stories, leaks to the press, anonymous complaints, maybe another confrontation, but this time with more eyes on them. Or on you." Chuck's eyes flashed. "Let them watch." The captain didn't respond. He offered a small nod and turned to leave. Gina followed Chuck to the door and closed it after Harrow disappeared down the path. She exhaled slowly. "They're going to find another way to try to own this," she said. "I know," Chuck said. "What are we going to do?" Chuck didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked down the hall and into his study. From the desk drawer, he removed a leather folder. Inside were his old law enforcement certifications, his Texas Ranger ID, long expired, and several commendations earned decades ago. It wasn't nostalgia that made him hold them now. It was a reminder. He had worn the badge once, and he had respected what it stood for. Now others had twisted it. Later that afternoon, while Gina took a shower, he called a friend, an old colleague from his Ranger days. They spoke briefly, discreetly. The friend promised to make a few inquiries. Chuck returned to the living room and sat alone. The sun was starting to slide behind the trees outside, shadows creeping longer across the hardwood floor. His mind ran through possibilities, scenarios, responses. He didn't want war, but he wasn't naive. If Blake and Martin planned to escalate, subtly, quietly, with the plausible deniability of cowards, he would be ready. Gina reappeared just before sunset, hair damp, wearing a fresh dress, this one simple and understated. Her steps were lighter now, her eyes more focused. He stood and met her halfway. "I made a few calls," he said. "Who?" "People who remember who I was before the movies." She nodded, not needing details. They stood at the window together as the sky burned orange and violet. Then Chuck stepped back, reached into a drawer and removed something wrapped in black cloth. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a small, elegantly boxed pendant, rose gold with a simple diamond in the center. "I bought this a few weeks ago," he said. "Thought I'd wait for your birthday." She stared at it. "What is it?" "It's not an apology. It's not consolation. It's a reminder that what they tried to take from you, your pride, your grace, your presence, they never owned in the first place, and they never will." She took it in her hands, eyes shining now, not from pain, but gratitude. Later that evening, the phone rang again. Unknown number. Chuck answered. The voice on the other end was familiar, muffled slightly but unmistakable. "You think this is over?" Blake's voice hissed. "You think you walk away from this with your head high and we just disappear?" Chuck didn't speak. "You embarrassed us, made us look weak. That doesn't go away with a jacket and a speech." The line went dead. Chuck stared at the receiver for a long moment. He didn't curse. He didn't growl. He simply replaced it in the cradle and turned to find Gina standing in the doorway. "They're not done, are they?" she asked. "No," he said, "but neither am I." She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest. "This time," he said, "they're going to find out what it means when I stop being polite." Outside, the wind picked up. The trees swayed in the growing dusk, and somewhere, far from the warmth of their home, two men planned their next mistake. The morning sun rose behind the glass walls of the Norris residence with a brightness that seemed, for the first time in days, honest. It spilled across the marble counters and kissed the edge of the living room rug with golden warmth, creeping gently toward the quiet figures seated within. Gina sat at the dining table with her legs curled beneath her, wrapped in a thin cream-colored robe, sipping coffee without speaking. Chuck was across from her, not reading, not checking his phone, just watching. The silence between them had lost its tension. It wasn't awkward or ominous. It was restorative. The phone hadn't rung again, not since the last call from Blake. Chuck had been expecting more. Another message, a veiled threat, maybe even an officer showing up under the pretense of official business. But nothing came. There was no news report twisting the truth. No articles spun into weaponized opinion. No press camped outside the gate. It was too quiet. And Chuck knew the type of men who created that kind of quiet. It was the quiet of retreat, but not of surrender. It was a temporary silence before they tried to reassert their dominance by some other means. But that was fine. He had waited his whole life in moments like this, between strikes, listening, preparing. The night before, he had warned Gina. He had told her he wouldn't be as restrained the next time. Not if they came for her again. He meant it. But he also knew she had already endured more than anyone should have to. He didn't want her to carry more weight just so he could stand taller in his own sense of righteousness. What had happened was real. It had hurt her, it had humiliated her, and while he couldn't take that moment back, he could give her something forward. A moment that belonged to her, not to them. He waited until she finished her coffee before standing and retrieving the simple, slim box from the entryway table. He placed it in front of her without ceremony, his face unreadable. She tilted her head. "What's this?" "You'll know when you see it." She opened it and stared. Her breath hitched slightly. Inside lay a gown. Not extravagant, not glittering, but elegant in a way that could only be called defiant. It was crimson, strong in hue, constructed from heavier fabric than the silk that had failed her. The neckline was modest, the silhouette powerful. It was not meant to seduce or flatter. It was meant to stand. Gina lifted her eyes to meet his. "I wanted you to have something new," he said, "something that doesn't replace what was taken. Just something that can't be taken." She didn't speak for a long time. Then she nodded. "I want to wear it tonight." Chuck simply said, "Then I'll take you wherever you want to go." The hours passed without incident. No patrol cars, no calls. Chuck spent the afternoon outside in the yard, running hand tools over the old fence post he had promised to replace months ago. Gina disappeared into the bedroom for hours, emerging only once to ask him to zip up the back of the gown, her face partially turned so he couldn't see the full expression in her eyes. But when she stepped back in front of the mirror and caught his reflection behind her, she knew she was seen. As the sun dipped behind the treetops and the air cooled with promise, they stepped out onto the porch. Chuck offered her his arm the same way he had that night outside the French room, but this time she held it tighter. This time there was no trace of hesitation in her posture. They drove in silence for a while, letting the open road speak for them. He hadn't picked a destination yet, but Gina didn't ask. She trusted him to find one. Somewhere with no memories in the walls, no laughter turned sour, no ghosts waiting in the corners. After 20 minutes, he pulled into a quiet restaurant overlooking a small private lake, the lot half full and the world hushed by dusk. Inside, they were greeted not as celebrities, but as guests. No one recognized them. No one stared. They were seated by a window, with candles low and music softer still. The waitress smiled without assumption. Gina ordered red wine. Chuck ordered water. And for the first time in days, they had a meal in which the quiet didn't feel like a defense mechanism. Halfway through the meal, she reached across the table and laid her hand over his. "You know, this won't be the last time something like this happens," she said. "I know," he replied, "and you can't fight them all." Chuck's jaw flexed. "I can fight the ones who come too close." "I know," she said, echoing him. The rest of the meal passed with a kind of calm that doesn't announce itself. It's the calm that waits, the kind earned and protected. And when they stepped outside again, stars had taken over the sky, and the lake below mirrored the night. As they reached their car, Chuck noticed it first. Parked across the lot, angled just wrong, headlights off, another cruiser. He said nothing, only opened the door for Gina and helped her inside. Once she was settled, he walked around and got into the driver's seat. They didn't pull out. Not yet. "I saw it," Gina said softly. "I figured." The cruiser didn't move, but its presence was a statement. "They're just watching," she said, "trying to remind us." "They think they're still in control," he replied. "And they're not?" Chuck started the engine and slowly backed out of the space. The cruiser followed at a distance. 2 turns, 1 light, another long stretch of dark road. Always behind, never beside. "They think if they don't touch us, it doesn't count," Gina said, her voice sharper now. "They think as long as no one's filming, it's safe." Chuck's eyes narrowed. "Let them follow. They'll get tired before I do." But he didn't believe that. Not really. Men like Blake didn't get tired. They got desperate. The tail lasted 8 blocks before the cruiser turned off. No lights, no signals. It just disappeared down a side street. "Do you think that's it?" she asked. "No," Chuck said. "They're just thinking." Back at the house, the gate opened the moment they approached. The security system had already logged the tail. Chuck checked the logs as they entered. Unknown vehicle, no access attempt. Inside, Gina walked straight to the bedroom, removing the gown with slow movements and laying it carefully across the bed. She didn't speak. Chuck watched from the doorway. She wasn't afraid. She was calculating the way he was. The way you become after someone tries to break you in public and fails. He didn't tell her about the call he'd received while she dressed earlier. From Blake again, no threats this time, just quiet venom, a reminder that men like him didn't forget. "You made us look weak. That doesn't go away." Chuck knew what that meant. He had faced men like Blake before, men who believed silence was weakness. That dignity was something you could peel away with a sneer and a badge. But they never understood what strength looked like until it was too late. He stepped behind Gina, placed his hands on her shoulders, and met her eyes in the mirror. "They might come back," she said. "Let them," he answered. "They already crossed the line. If they try again, they won't make it to the other side." The next morning passed in stillness. Gina moved through her usual rituals, reading by the window, folding linens, making phone calls to her sister. Chuck spent time in the garden, gloves on, tending to plants she had long thought he'd forgotten. Every so often, they would glance at the driveway. Nothing. At noon, another chime. Chuck moved to the intercom screen, his body coiled before his fingers reached for the button. The same patrol car. Alone. Blake. He stood outside the gate, no partner, no car running, hands at his sides. Chuck said nothing, just watched. Gina came to the monitor. Her eyes flicked to her husband's face, then to the screen. "Let him in," she said. Chuck did. When Blake reached the door, Chuck opened it. The two men stood eye to eye again, this time in broad daylight. No sirens, no accusations, just truth and memory between them. "I'm not here for trouble," Blake said. "You already brought it," Chuck replied. "I came because this is the only part I still control," Blake said. "My partner, he's done. They're digging through everything. He's looking at charges, and me, maybe I should be." Chuck waited. "I thought I was in control," Blake continued. "I thought being in uniform meant something, that I could say things, do things, and people would just take it. But when I looked back at that footage, at her face, I realized I became the man I used to hate." Gina stepped beside Chuck. "You didn't just touch my dress," she said. "You tried to tear something out of me." Blake nodded. "And I couldn't look my wife in the eye this morning without seeing your face." Silence. Then Chuck spoke. "So why are you here?" "Because I didn't want your story ending with just a dress torn and a threat made. I wanted to say it to your faces. What I did was wrong, and I'll carry it. You won't have to." Gina didn't flinch. She didn't forgive, but she didn't look away. Chuck gave a slow nod. "Then carry it." Blake turned to leave. At the gate, he paused. "Martin's gone, off the force. That's a part of why I came now, before this gets worse." Back inside, the house was quiet again, but something in the silence had changed. Not justice, not redemption, but accountability. Later that day, Chuck drove to the boutique where Gina's original dress had been purchased. The same saleswoman greeted him. "Looking for something special again, Mr. Norris?" He smiled faintly. "Something stronger." That evening, Gina stood before the mirror in a new gown, sleek, powerful, bold red. She turned slightly, checking the seams the way it moved when she did. Chuck leaned in the doorway, watching. "That's the one," he said. She turned to him with a quiet smile. "I feel like a queen." "You are," he replied. And as the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the city, they stepped out together once more, not as victims of what had happened, but as people who had stood their ground, preserved their dignity, and emerged not broken, but defined. They thought they could humiliate someone without consequences. They were wrong. Now the whole world knew what real strength looked like. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to see it. And stick around. More powerful stories are on the way. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from.